If you really have to think about something that's complex, coming into and out of it is just not that helpful. I know that there are certain conversations that are much harder to have and certain, problems that are harder to solve. So one of the things I try to do in terms of the way I manage our team is for those types of either decisions or interactions, we come together and we all block a day or two just to focus and really go deep on something as opposed to trying to do the transactional 30, 40, 50-minute meetings.
Welcome to a remastered edition of the Corporate Competitor Podcast presented by Forbes Books. We're bringing back one of our most popular episodes, this time in a brand new way. Originally released as audio only, this conversation is now available on video for the very first time, giving you a fresh perspective on one of our greatest interviews. This is part of a new series we're calling the Corporate Competitor Classics, where we revisit powerful, timeless leadership lessons from the archives and bring them to life anew on screen. Today's episode features the CEO of FanDuel, Amy Howe, one of my favorite people. I love me some Amy. She joined FanDuel from Live Nation Entertainment, where she held several positions, culminating as global COO of Ticketmaster. She led the digital transformation, growing the mobile app install base by 400%. Her sports interests span coast to coast. She's a Cornell alum and a Buffalo Bills fan, long-suffering, and a loyal supporter of UCLA athletics. We have a lot of John Wooden in common. I'm excited for you to hear her story here. Amy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Don. I'm so excited to be here.
It's awesome. I know we're both lovers of Coach Wooden and UCLA athletics, and had the opportunity several months ago to meet at the MIT Sloan conference. So the possibility of getting in and learning more of your journey to the leadership at FanDuel is really quite impactful. We're excited about it today.
No, thank you. And yes, we are. I'm a big John Wooden fan, so we have a lot in common.
Yeah, I know. We probably raised our children teaching them Coach Wooden quotes all over the place.
Sure did. Most quoted individual in our household.
I love it. That's awesome. Amy, I want to go back to growing up in a farming community, Eden, New York. Identical twin sister, older brother, very competitive, household, lots of competition here. Talk to me about how competition and the way you viewed competition impacted your childhood.
Oh, it has been such a huge driver of my childhood, but also I would say my success in life, success as as an executive, but also success as a mom and a wife. And you're right. I grew up in a very small town, Eden, New York. Most people have no idea where Eden, New York is. It's actually south of Buffalo, maybe 7,000, people on a good day. It's actually a very high integrity, hardworking, really a farming community is what Eden is. And I share that context because you're right. I have an identical twin sister. And so there was an element of, I would argue we were the big fish in a very small pond. And I'll tell you, there are a few things that will make you more competitive in life than having an identical twin sister and being in a small town where people compare literally everything you do. We always describe it as healthy rivalry, right? When two competitors play against each other, you kind of up each other's games. And that's exactly what my sister Kelly and I have done our entire life. But there's also an element of where we grew up. I think a big part of what I learned growing up in a town like Eden and in Buffalo is the grit and determination. Trust me, trying to make it through those winters in Buffalo, you have to have some level of grit. But it's also a very high integrity, low ego kind of community. And I've taken that with me really my whole life. So there's so much I've taken with me because of, growing up in Eden and having an identical twin sister.
Walk me through grit for you as a young competitor, and I know you've loved athletics. Like, what does grit look like for you, and the ability to kind of to make yourself a little tougher than some of the others?
Well, it's funny because my husband and we have three boys. We have a 16-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 10-year-old. And this is probably one of the things that I and we talk about the most, which is, to me, what grit is when you get knocked down, which you're going to get knocked down your whole life, right? The ability to pick yourself back up and move on and be better because of that experience. And I talk to my kids about this all the time. It's funny. The other day, this was at the end of the school year. My son he had COVID. He was behind in all of his exams. And we talk about that, the ability to kind of pick yourself up when you're having a really tough time and know that you'll prevail. And one of the things that I talk about with my employees, my younger folks who are coming out of undergrad, is that grit is actually, it's a muscle that you need to develop and build over time, right? It may not come naturally. But as I say, I just turned 50 this year. I'm like, it doesn't matter how old you are, you're always going to have peaks and valleys in life and your career. And so your ability to grit is really resilience and picking yourself back up when you face those tough times. So I just think it's such a critical skill set that if you can learn that early on in life, both in sports and in careers and just in life in general, I think it's a defining characteristic of people.
I love that. I love that grit is a muscle, right? That's so well put. Who was your greatest influence in your athletic journey? Someone who, whether it was a parent or a coach or someone who really kind of pushed you maybe beyond your limits?
It's funny because I grew up in an era where we did all the sports, right? I started out as a competitive gymnast. That was my first true entrance into competitive sports. And as a competitive gymnast, right, you're both on a team, but you're also competing individually. And I will say, early on, there were a couple of coaches that I had that just, I saw what it looked like to really invest in somebody, right, and give them the tough feedback and make sure that they're putting the grit, if you will, and grinding and really working really hard. But for me, it wasn't. So my early gymnastics coaches were instrumental, but there was also an element of what my parents and my mom in particular did for me. My mom was she didn't work. She actually never went to college. And my parents believed in exposing us to a lot of different types of sports. They philosophically believed that sports were really critical because you were going to learn so many life skills. So, I did gymnastics and tennis and golf, and I was on a swim team. And, we kind of did the rotation, which in some respects is actually very different than what I see. Youth sports right now are a little bit different. And maybe, I don't know if I'm being biased because I live on the West Coast, but I feel like now kids are being asked to specialize so early. And, at some level, you just want them to be able to do the full range of sports and not have to, third or fourth grade specialize in one activity. So I think the fact that, my mom in particular, she was always the one that was picking up my sister and I at gymnastics and taking us to our swim lesson or whatever it was. But she was there and committed. And that really had a profound impact because, sports is something I've taken with me throughout my entire life.
I love that idea that you were moving around and actually learning different skills and different, because that's the beauty of all those different sports. They're exercising not just your body but your mind to stretch in different places. But can you think of a story where some leadership lesson you learned through that journey might have influenced the way you lead today as the CEO of FanDuel?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think the thing that I have taken with me, and it's, I think it's a combination of looking at so many different teams that I participated in, is how you build a high performing team. And, it's funny, I went from gymnastics into cheerleading for many years. I would actually hide the fact that I was a cheerleader. And now I'm actually quite proud of it because if I look at the team that I built, my sister and I really built together. It was a phenomenal team. And I think many of the things that I've taken from that are very, not just cheerleading, just in general, are very relevant to how you build high performing teams, right? So there's a few things I would say. One is you can't just gravitate to people that are like you, right? Imagine having a team of all quarterbacks. that doesn't work, right? So you need to make sure that you're building a team that meets the skill profiles for what that team needs to be successful. So you need different personality profiles. So diversity is it actually matters, right? When you're building a team. The other thing that I've really taken away is the importance of being coachable. We talk about this to our kids all the time, right? Being coachable in life, whether it's in a sport or in business, is such a critical characteristic. And sometimes it's really hard to be coachable, right? As you and I both know. And then I think there's also the flip side of that, which is sometimes the best athletes are not always the best coaches, right? You see that with some of the best athletes in the world, whether it's a Michael Jordan or pick your favorite athlete,
Magic Johnson, yeah.
Dr. Johnson, right? So I just there's so many elements of for me at least, what probably the biggest takeaways are how you build and create a really high performing team that I've taken from my many years of being a competitive athlete.
I love that. So can we go back to being coachable? How have you learned to be coachable, and how are you teaching it?
For me, I think partly growing up as an athlete, but I will say growing up at McKinsey, I was at McKinsey for almost 15 years. And it is a culture that if you cannot figure out how to be coachable and take you're getting feedback all the time, right? Literally on a daily, weekly basis, you're not going to be successful. And part of it is McKinsey was built as an apprenticeship culture, and recognizing that people are really your primary, you could argue your only asset. So if you're not investing in your people, which means you're constantly giving them professional feedback, and how do you continue to grow as a leader, then you're not going to get the best out of people. And so I was raised in an environment, candidly, where having to be coachable, and then on the flip side, investing in my team and coaching them and apprenticing them was just a fundamental. It was a fabric of the firm.
The beauty of the listeners of this podcast is most are executives or young executives wanting to grow into a space. They're looking to learn from you. What advice would you give me on how to be better at accepting feedback?
There's two things I would say. Well, I think one is just recognizing if there's not a single person in the world who isn't working on something, right? Whether it's personally or professionally, or trying to eat better, exercise, or whatever it is, right? So I think just at some level recognizing that we're all humans and that we're all working to be better every single day is really important. Second, I think sometimes becoming a better listener and just absorbing before some people, and listen, myself included, sometimes you have a tendency to want to react right away and say, well, here are the 5 reasons why that doesn't make sense. Becoming a good listener is part of being coachable, but it's also, I think, part of just, improving yourself both personally and professionally. And that can be very hard. Being a good listener can be really hard.
It seems like you always have to be thinking several steps ahead because you're in an industry that changes daily, right? You aren't sure what league or what regulatory body is going to shift the way your work is perceived or even run. How do you constantly stay on the ready at FanDuel?
Yeah, well, you're spot on. This is definitely an industry where if you're looking for certainty, this is not a great industry for you to be in, right? Massachusetts just was legalized the other night. Will California, be approved on the ballot this November? Don't know, right? So there's a massive amount of uncertainty. For me, fortunately, I've come from industries, right? And ticketing is a great example that in some respects were prime for disruption. But I also lived through the largest shutdown of the live entertainment industry and, with COVID. And so there's an element of being, learning how to be agile when you're operating in highly uncertain and dynamic environments. I think there's a couple of takeaways that I've had, and this goes back to even my early years in consulting, which is learning to embrace ambiguity is really important, right? There are very few jobs, industries, careers where you're going to have certainty. And if COVID taught us one thing, it certainly taught us that that you have to be able to operate in very uncertain times. But the other thing I think is really important to kind of staying on the ready, if you will, is knowing when to move quickly and knowing when to be a bit more methodical, right? So, Bezos and others always talk about one-way versus two-way doors. Being able to quickly ascertain what type of decision you're making is really important, especially when things are changing so quickly. Because there are times where you actually do need to move quickly, and then there are other times where, on the flip side, moving too quickly actually is a liability.
Is it pure gut instinct, or are there things that when you're trying to make a decision, gosh, do we want to jump in here now? Do we want to let the waters calm for a second? Are there things you look for as a leader that help you define that pathway?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer to this may have changed throughout my career. But listen, what I would say is, um, when I have pattern recognition around something and I have, a high degree of certainty that I know what the right answer is, I'll move and I'll make the decision quickly. If, however, I know the stakes of a certain decision are higher and I may not, I'm pretty good at admitting what I don't know. And if I feel like, I need to make sure I get the facts or pull in, a broader set of voices before I make a decision. Now that second bucket is, the longer you're, in your career, you see more, you have more exposure to different types of problems and pattern recognition. But the reality is, if you take sports betting, there's a lot of things that we're up against that nobody has solved before. So I think being able to distinguish between the types of decisions, but also I think there's an element of making sure you can check your ego at the door on some of these decisions too, and admitting that if you don't have the answers, you actually need to take a minute to at least get the right facts before you're hasty and make a decision.
Yeah, and you've had to do that in your previous position as well at Ticketmaster, where you were busy, as you said, trying to figure out how do we go through the greatest shutdown in the history of that entire industry. But even in the middle of all of that, you continued to find ways to grow the organization. Um, you know, uh, Helping the mobile app grow as it did, other things in moments where uncertainty is the only certainty. In those moments, how are you continuing to convince people that there is a plan?
Well, gosh, during there's so many things I learned in that moment. I think the one of the things that as a leader that I really took away from managing during that uncertain period of COVID is um, honesty and transparency goes a long way, right? I mean, nobody gives you a handbook for how you manage through a pandemic. And you saw leaders react one of two ways. Some leaders would literally go into a bunker and figure out, they wanted to solve the problem and then come out and communicate to the organization. And there were other leaders who I think were very open and honest, not to say that the former weren't, but I think just being transparent and saying, I don't have all the answers right now. We're going to work through this together, and I'm going to give you as much transparency as I can. And as we go through this is really critical. I also think having real empathy in those moments
Mm.
matters a lot. And it's not just a COVID situation. I mean, every day as a leader, you see what we're doing is incredibly hard, and I don't always understand what folks may be facing at home. So being empathetic and creating an environment where people feel safe is really important as a leader. And I think if COVID taught us anything, it did teach us that. And so I think bringing that into how I lead day to day, COVID or pandemic or not, has been really important.
So I'm a sucker for stories. I love both hearing them and telling them. But is there a story of some place during all of that anxiety, that angst, that where your ability to show empathy into your environment made a difference? A story you might share with us of empathy actually at work.
Yeah, there's one moment in particular that I'll never forget, and as you can imagine, right? Everyone was trying to figure out in the very early days of the pandemic, how long this thing was going to last. We all got it wrong, right? And I remember when I last left the Live Nation headquarters, we all kind of looked at each other and we're like, we know this feels weird, but not really sure when we're going to be back. And so it was, we were trying to decide how quickly you hold on before you need to start to, manage your cost base. And at some point, obviously, we needed to do, there was a lot of government subsidy, which was incredibly helpful. But at some point, we also needed to do some furloughs. And I remember after that very first call, my former boss, Jared Smith, and he did one call and I did the other call for folks who were getting furloughed and folks who were staying. And it was by far the hardest professional moment of my career, right? Because these people didn't do anything wrong. They just happened to be in an industry which literally went from, was booming to a complete shutdown overnight. And so I think just being, empathetic and transparent, and in this particular call, a little bit emotional because it was real and authentic. It went a long way. And from that point on, I think the entire organization knew that that we were doing the best we can the best we could to manage through a very difficult transition with a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And so we did try to increase our communications, and you can't give people certainty in those situations, but you can at least give them as much transparency as possible. But it was a really hard moment. I remember finishing that call and feeling about as bad as I've ever felt in my professional career.
Wow. You know, one of the things that has marked your career and many of the different aspects of it that I had the chance to study in prepping for today is you're a John Wooden fan, so I shouldn't be surprised by this. But you're a stickler for the importance of preparation, right? About understanding that it's our job to be mentally, physically, emotionally prepared to for opportunity and challenge. How do you teach that to other people? I mean, there are a lot of folks who just love the flying by the seat of their pants. If you're a leader who loves preparation, how are you teaching others without taking off their shoes and socks? How are you teaching them the art of preparation?
Well, one of our favorite John Wooden quotes in our family is failing to prepare is preparing to fail.
Yes.
And it's so true, right? And, there's so many different aspects of preparing, whether it's as an athlete or as an executive. And, I truly believe that the mental, the physical, and the emotional, there's preparation you need to do in all three of those. But when you feel prepared and strong on all three of those dimensions, it just makes you a higher performing individual and executive. For me, this is one of the things that I've always had a level of discipline my entire life, and that has been one of the defining characteristics of me. But there's some things I do to just maintain that. One is I run every single morning, or I do some sort of exercise because obviously it helps physically, but it is actually the moment of the day where I feel like I can clear my head. I can think about, what I need to get done for the day. It's a massive stress reliever for me to be able to, and I actually view it as a privilege, right? To be able to exercise and work out every day. But I do believe in the importance of being prepared, whether it's in big moments, like when I had to testify in front of Congress. Trust me, I prepped for that.
A day's worth.
Yeah, well, I walked around with a binder for a long time, making sure I knew my stuff. But I do think there is an element of putting the hard strokes in and grinding at some level. The best athletes in the world are the ones that prepare, right? Look at what Kobe Bryant did, and
Unseen hours.
Yeah, I mean, he was up at the crack of dawn, and he was just always putting the hours in. Now, that doesn't mean you need to do what Kobe Bryant does, but showing up, whether it's for an important meeting or even having a thoughtful conversation with an employee where you're going to give them tough feedback, just being thoughtful about how you have those interactions actually matters in life.
How do you build preparation time into your calendar?
Well, One of the things I learned really how to do very early on is how to manage my time well. And I think, by the way, that's also a skill and a little bit of a muscle. It's one of the things they actually teach kids in school is how to manage your time. But I've gotten a little bit better about how I manage my calendar, right? If you let your calendar just kind of happen to you and it gets filled up with meetings, some which you may or may not be in, then you're probably not spending your time in the most effective manner. So I will try to consciously block out, in the morning. If I don't get my workout in the morning, it typically doesn't happen. And I've figured that out over time. But I also try to build in time for me to think, right? Because if you're in transactional meetings all day long, it's really difficult to do higher quality, deeper thinking. And so I actively manage my calendar to be able to fit in the physical and, um, take the time to invest in being emotionally prepared and mentally prepared.
So I have to say, we've done 100 plus of these interviews, and you're one of the first to really talk about that idea of building in time to think. Can you can you walk me through that process a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways that I do it. Well, first of all, some of my favorite time is when I'm on a plane ride because nobody distracts me. I can block everything out and really focus on something because as you know, if you really have to think about something that's complex, complex strategy problems, or you've got to review a document in a really thoughtful way, coming into and out of it is just not that helpful. So sometimes it's just a matter of figuring out how I block the time. But for me, also I know that I work better at certain like I tend to be a morning person, and so if I've got to do something that is more complicated and I just need more alone time, then I'll do it in the morning. But I also do this in terms of how we manage our teams. I know that there are certain conversations that are much harder to have and certain, problems that are harder to solve if either we're just on a Zoom call or we're doing an hour here or there. So one of the things I try to do in terms of the way I manage our team is for those types of either decisions or interactions, we come together and we all block a day or two just to focus and really go deep on something as opposed to trying to do the transactional 30, 40, 50-minute meetings, which typically don't get you to the right outcome for more complex decisions.
You mentioned earlier your time at McKinsey, and I, the one thing that's always fascinated me about consultants and people that are in that space is that you're that third party, right? You're outside throwing advice in, hoping to help them find their way, helping organizations find their way. Uh, what was the transition like being an outside voice to becoming an internal leader, where in many ways now the voice matters? Everything will come down to your decisions. What was that transition like?
It's such a good question because I was in consulting for 17 years, so you could argue
Right.
I was a career consultant before I moved over. I always had a hunch that I was going to love being an operator, and now having made the transition, I was right. I will tell you, to answer your question around what the transition was like, there's a healthy dose of pragmatism that you learn really quickly when you make the transition from being a McKinsey consultant into being in an operating role. And Michael Rapino, the CEO of Live Nation, was always very good at this. He always joked about consultants needing to go through a bit of detox when they move into a real organization. And I do think that was a really important learning for me and how I made that transition. That you're not always going to have a McKinsey team implementing everything you do, and the more you can, if you will, make the complex simple for organizations, you're probably going to get a lot more done rather than trying to juggle too many things. But listen, I'll also tell you there's so many things that I learned from having been really a career counselor to CEOs for many years that have made me a better leader too.
Give me an example of someplace where your work at being a counselor to a CEO has made you a better leader? I mean, is it the kind of questions you're learning to ask?
Yeah, it's a few things because I've reflected on this a lot since I've many years ago made the transition. Part of what consulting teaches you is how to solve very complex problems that you've never solved before, right? And the toolkit you get for being able to dissect a problem and break it down and solve that in a fact-based way. But also, typically, you're solving, in many cases, either politically charged or emotionally charged decisions, or where you're going to have multiple points of view in an organization. And so there's an art for how, not just how you solve the problem, but also how you make those decisions less emotional and less political, that I learned from being an advisor. And then, the other thing is, at the end of the day, you have to, in order to be impactful, you have to learn the art of influencing your stakeholders, in many cases, a broad set of stakeholders. And those people don't report to you. So when I first came into, both Live Nation and even FanDuel, uh, nobody reported to me at first at Live Nation because I was in a chief strategy role, but I got a lot done because I knew how to work in an organization. And so there's an element of, I don't care who reports to me. I know how to work in an organization that I was able to bring with me candidly from being an advisor.
I love it. A couple of questions we've asked several guests recently explores the concept of momentum, right? And right now, FanDuel, you all, your industry, your business, I mean, you are in quite a momentum-filled window. Many of us who love sports can feel momentum, right? We see it on the field or court, and that's true in business too, in my opinion. But sometimes you don't get the chance to see it as broadly because it's not broadcast on live TV. Sometimes you have a moment that helps propel you or even your opponent forward. And first off, I'd love to ask you, as both a competitor and athlete and as a CEO, do you believe in momentum? And secondly, I'd love to, if so, have you had a moment or an event, maybe even in your current role, where something has happened that has given you that oomph, and how do you extend that momentum?
Yeah, it's a great question. I absolutely believe in the concept of momentum, and to your point, I mean, we see it in sports all the time, right? And when you're watching, I've been to umpteen UCLA basketball games and Buffalo Bill games, and when somebody has a buzzer beater heading into the half or scores a touchdown right before the quarter of the half, it creates momentum, and vice versa, right? If your opponent ends up getting that momentum. So I absolutely believe it. At the end of the day, if I look at my business, it's a flywheel business. And as you know, with flywheel businesses, the hardest thing is actually getting momentum in the first place. But once you have it, it becomes much easier. For me personally, and I'll use an example at FanDuel. When I stepped into the interim CEO role about a year ago, and then formally took over as CEO in October. And as you can imagine, when you're stepping in as interim CEO, the most important thing for me was to make sure that I could build the best leadership team around me, right? I always say it doesn't matter how good I am, I don't scale as an individual. And so as I thought about that, I knew that there were certain folks that had been with FanDuel since the very early daily fantasy sports days, right before sports betting was ever legalized. And so their institutional knowledge was really important. At the same time, we're changing rapidly. The company is scaling, and so there was an acknowledgement that in some cases we needed to bring new talent into the organization. And for so I acknowledged early on that making sure I have the best possible leadership team was one of the most important things I could do as a CEO. And where you really start, first of all, I was incredibly appreciative of the team that I had at the time, because they said, we're behind you, you've got this, and we're supportive. And just knowing that, it gave me momentum, but it also allowed me the space to be able to figure out how we build the best team in the industry, right? And it was a combination of locking certain folks in that have been there for a long time, figuring out where do we need to bring some new talents into the organization. So it's a different form of momentum, but it was that, you see how those people choices can make a huge difference in an organization.
Well, and obviously then as the people choices coalesce and then good things start to happen, you have the right people in place to be able to take advantage of those good things. And obviously that's a huge piece of building the momentum loop that's so fascinating to us. Amy, I appreciate the John Wooden would be proud. You got a good Wooden quote in. You're raising your children properly, Papa would say. But most importantly, I thank you today for being willing to invest knowledge in us and for being a corporate competitor.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun.
Boy, Amy really had so much energy, and she definitely channeled her inner John Wooden for this conversation. Could not be more grateful for that time and the lessons. I think the couple of things that stood out most to me was how her childhood and her competitiveness as a child, that growing up in a world where grit was so valued, and that willingness to be able to kind of build the muscle that she called grit, allowed her to manage her time in uncertain moments. And what a great lesson that is for all the rest of us, right? Grit is that ability to show resiliency, to be able and available even when others would rather curl up on the couch. So being able to bring her best into massive uncertainty and to create that agility that she referred to, what a great lesson. But I most took away her commitment to building time to think. Boy, what a concept. Unfortunately, in our crowded days and our schedule that just continuously piles upon us, carving out that time, being intentional about it, requiring yourself to be able to sit, go clear-minded, and think through the challenges that we have ahead. Those are the moments that will change and better our outcomes. What a great lesson. I can't thank Amy enough. Let's go out today. Let's use these lessons and let's go be corporate competitors.
I love golf shirts. I love the comfort of a golf shirt, especially in the summer. I love to wear them when I'm traveling, but unfortunately, if I'm on stage or if I'm working with clients, too often I'm also required to wear a sport coat. I have to look good, and golf shirts don't always allow that to happen. Too often the collars curl up, and so I found the solution. A company I've been following for a while. I started watching them on Shark Tank many years ago, and now they are a partner. I get a chance to wear their shirts often. Collars & Co. is the name of the company. You should check them out.